right, welcome everyone to our first installment of the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics Spring 2026 Speaker Series. I'm Todd Haw, Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School and the Faculty Director of the ICGE. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by our wonderful speaker, Ruth Schmidt from the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech. But before I turn things over to Ruth, I'd like to say a quick word about the ICGE. The Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics takes a broad, interdisciplinary, and systems-based approach to corporate governance and ethics research. So not only do we consider corporate governance in its full scope, which includes the areas of finance, management, corporate law, corporate compliance, business and behavioral ethics, and financial controls, but we also aim to make that research accessible to business practitioners. So as part of that effort, last year, the ICGE brought Ethical Systems, a consortium of business and behavioral ethics scholars, to the Kelley School, which doubled the number of our faculty affiliates and created an entirely new network of collaborators under the ICGE umbrella, as well as a new platform to reach business leaders. So bringing the ICGE and Ethical Systems together has created a one-of-a-kind institution that is able to harness the best academic research to aid students and scholars, policymakers, and business leaders in elevating corporate governance and ethical business practices within their organizations. So this speaker series is just one of the ways that we're doing that. So please check out our websites and LinkedIn for new initiatives and activities coming from the ICGE and Ethical Systems in the future. And I should also mention that we recently issued our first kind of yearly report. So you can see everything that we've done over the last year in one digital space. Just go to the ICGE website to take a look. And now let me introduce our speaker for today. Professor Ruth Schmidt is an associate professor at the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech in Chicago. Her teaching and research integrate human-centered design, systems design, and behavioral science to address behavioral challenges systemically and equitably. Her research projects and publications, which run the gamut from studying things like wicked behavioral problems to reframing how we consider public policy challenges through a systems lens, combine disciplines to create better informed solutions for commercial, academic, and public policy challenges. As part of this work, she has developed new tools and conceptual models to help academics and practitioners understand and solve problems more systematically and completely, which has led to publications in the leading applied behavioral science and design journals, such as Behavioral Public Policy, Journal of Design Strategies, Strategic Decision Research Journal, and Policy Design and Practice. After receiving her undergraduate degree in art and semiotics from Brown University, which also happens to be my alma mater, by the way, so it's a great place, and a Master of Design with a concentration in design strategy from the Institute of Design, Ruth has has held several leadership positions at design consultancies, including as a senior leader at Doblin Deloitte from 2009 to 2017. And there she developed applied behavioral design methodologies and led teams to advance innovation efforts at numerous organizations. She also served as a senior design advisor and member of the leadership team at the Chicago Learning Network, working with educational and cultural organizations such as the MacArthur Foundation, the Art Institute of Chicago, Museum of Science and Industry, and the Chicago Public Library. Ruth continues to consult on behavioral design for companies in the healthcare, financial services, education, and food sectors, and she has become a sought-after speaker anywhere organizations or policy groups are looking for innovative, systems-based solutions for the thorniest behavioral problems. And that, to me, epitomizes a lot of what corporate governance and ethics is all about. So if we consider this topic in its full scope, it truly is a field that requires us to think in systems and design solutions that run from the individual all the way up to the enterprise. And so there's no one better to introduce us to that way of thinking than Ruth Schmidt. So Ruth, we're so excited to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Todd. And it's really a pleasure to be here and looking forward to diving into not just behavioral economics and behavioral science, but especially applied to the governance and ethics space, which I think is, since my background is in more of the corporate space, I had a sort of up close and personal view about how things work and how things go wrong. So very glad to be here to bring that with you to this audience. I'm going to share my screen so I can kind of jump in here. Hopefully folks can see that. So what I'm going to talk about today is this idea of how do we bring behavioral strategies for compliance and ethical behavior. And also I'll talk a little bit about how we can even expand our definitions of what that is, because saying something is ethical can make it sound like it's kind of precious and particular, whereas I might argue that a lot of the behaviors that we demonstrate all the time have an ethical dimension to them. And what I'm going to focus on in particular is a set of strategies which are what I call sort of this idea of positive friction, that sometimes getting in the way and slowing things down can be a really valuable strategy when we're trying to do the right thing. So I'm going to talk through a bunch of ways in which that shows up with lots of examples as well. But I thought what I would start with, because I do have this background in innovation and bringing it to corporate organizations, is less about the ethics just yet, but kind of understanding why is behavior so important and why is it so important in organizations. So in the role that I had when I was at Dublin Deloitte as a senior leader, my job was often to lead teams and help organizations become more innovative, essentially. And we did that in two ways, sometimes in more direct projects where we actually helped them do innovative work. But what I really found interesting was looking at the organization as the unit. And in those cases, frequently, we would talk to organizations, almost didn't matter who they were or what kind of organization, and they would ask us, why are our people not more innovative? We tell them to be innovative. We, strongly suggest that this is important. We have it in our name, but it just doesn't seem to stick. And what we would almost always find, and this is one of those patterns that once you start to see it, you see it all the time, is that behavior, like being innovative, is not one specific thing. It's actually a bunch of different conditions, often, which are either encouraging certain types of behaviors or inhibiting them. Now, in the case of innovation, for example, part of the challenge was that people may not even see themselves as innovative. So more of sort of an internal perception of what that was, or it seemed like there was the sort of reputation or the kind of, attributes that other people had. Designers are innovative, people in finance aren't. Not necessarily true. There were also often indicators that what was happening within the organization in more structured ways, like the infrastructures or the ways in which certain types of behaviors were prioritized or rewarded, had a huge impact. And that may seem kind of obvious, but for example, if you're being held to quarterly returns, it's going to limit your ability to do things which are more experimental or more exploratory because you know that you may not get rewarded for them. And in fact, you may actually end up getting penalized for not executing on the things you were expected to. So I share this as a start for two reasons. One is that this notion of how to think about organizations themselves as a unit of behavior is really interesting and has a lot of potential. And it's often the kind of thing where, yes, it's complex, but it can make a lot of progress. But also this idea of behavior, behavioral design or behavioral science being a way that we can chip away at some of these issues and increase the chances that some of these behaviors that we really want are actually going to happen. So when I say behavioral science or behavioral economics, some of these terms that people may know, I never know when I talk to an audience who knows, who's been exposed to what kinds of information. So just wanted to give a little bit of a grounding of like, when we say behavioral science and we talk about behavioral design, whether in organizations or not, what does that mean? So these are just a handful of books that may be more familiar than others. The term nudging has become kind of popularized as a way of sort of helping people to do the right thing by often helping them get out of their own way. Or the idea of thinking fast and slow as these two modes where sometimes we think sort of too quickly and impulsively, and we'd be better off thinking in a slow mode. And sometimes, in fact, the reverse is true. But at its core, if we think about what this is all about, behavioral science was really developed as a response to what was seen as sort of the normal way that people make decisions, which is that we think probabilistically and we're objective. So basically, what that is saying is that there's an expectation, if we're rational, that of course we're weighing all the important information that we have. And of course, we're weighing the chances that something is a good or a bad idea, but that we're being quite objective about it. And, we're being sort of logical and rational. That's kind of one condition that's expected. Another expected condition is that we have all the information we need. And if we have that information, we're also using it in an informed and in a thoughtful way. You could argue that now we actually have the opposite problem where we have too much information, but this idea that we are confident in what we are building our understanding and our choices are another thing. And then finally, we all expect that we act in our own best interest. We're making decisions which are good for us, which reflect our preferences, and there's a certain consistency to that. Now, what the behavioral researchers that I'm going to be sort of referring to throughout have sort of recognized, and many of us recognize ourselves in this too, because we're all human, is that these things aren't always true. Even the most logical and rational of us, we sometimes make sort of shorthand decisions. The fancy word for this is heuristics. But the idea that we sometimes take cognitive shortcuts to make decisions kind of makes sense, because otherwise we couldn't weigh, what the decision about what to have for lunch in the same way that we make a decision about who to hire. But these kind of quick judgments and these heuristics can sometimes lead us to choices that are maybe not optimal. We also sometimes have real challenges processing data in the way that we expect. And in fact, we tend to routinely misinterpret data, even if we have it. And sometimes we struggle because we can't, for example, prioritize information. We may have a lot of data, but we don't know what's important, and we don't know how to weigh it in a way that's going to be most effective. And finally, it's just the sort of human recognition that our preferences and what's in our best interests is not stable. They're often variable. They change by context. Over time, they especially may shift significantly. And even the way that a choice is positioned can have a real strong impact on whether we see something as being desirable or undesirable. So it's not to say that humans are flawed or messed up or that there's something wrong with us, but essentially, and this is but a small set of things, we kind of predictably fall into these patterns and these tendencies, not all the time and not always in the same way. But we don't necessarily process things logically, make logical decisions in the way that we might expect. So if we think about all of these things, we need to understand that we bring all of this sort of thinking and all of these sort of flawed thinking tendencies to our personal life and to our work life. There's also, they've been seen as a really interesting source of information and an interesting target for ethical behavior as well. So just a couple, there are more of authors and more articles, of course, but there are some folks who are digging really deeply into some of these issues and recognizing, for example, that the tendency to sort of increase corrupt behavior or how to reduce corruption can benefit from behavioral strategies. So this idea of only relying on sort of top-down regulation, that's good for certain types of things. It has a limited impact and effect, but being able to recognize why people sometimes fall into these bad tendencies and bad patterns allows us to get insight into how to prevent some of those behaviors. So even though these are specifically about corruption, the same general idea applies to other types of compliance or ethical behaviors. There are some researchers who have built their entire careers on some of these issues, and these are kind of fundamental ideas that have been studied. So the idea of why cheating seems appealing or why dishonesty occurs and what are the conditions under which we can kind of tee it up or reduce it. Folks who may have seen some of these names in the news may kind of already know the irony to a couple of the folks featured here. And this is not to rag on them in particular. These are just sort of newsworthy items which kind of shook the behavioral science field. So sharing them in that respect. Some of these leading researchers have actually themselves been accused of some of these fraudulent activities or things which certainly seem, on the gray or shady side of what we would consider ethical behavior. So again, not about calling individuals out for the specific things they did, but we can start to ask the question, if even well-trained experts in this field have these tendencies to sometimes not do the right thing, what does that mean for behavioral science? But also, what does it mean for how we might think about how to apply some of these ideas? And to that, I suggest, one of the things we can first of all recognize is that just like any individual may fall subject to some of the tendencies that we have just as human beings, behavioral researchers are human beings just like anyone else. So if we think about some of the things that may have kind of interrupted the sort of staying on the high road to do the right thing, we can start to ask some of these same questions from a behavioral angle. So for example, when you think about doing something wrong or falsifying data, does that mean that you thought about things in a logical and probabilistic way? We all know that sometimes the first step may seem a little tense. You may be worried about doing something that seems wrong. But honestly, we're all humans, and we probably all experience the sense that if you start to go down that road, it starts to become normalized. So suddenly, something that seems like outlier behavior actually feels quite normal. We've probably all done aspects of this. Um, in terms of weighing the information and seeing if the data itself, right? In some of these cases, folks have been accused of falsifying data itself. And again, what seems like a really sort of open and closed case gets a little bit more complicated because again, as humans, we're always, when we expect to see something, it may heighten our sense that that is what we are seeing, which may heighten our sense that let's just fix it a little bit. So the idea of actually weighing information accurately is again a little bit more complicated than it initially seems. Um, Wrongdoing often seems like it's not in one's best interest because who wants to do the wrong thing? But let's be honest, that is often a way to get short-term benefits. And in the academic field, often having novel results, getting good speaking gigs, those are great things. Those are very attractive. And so sometimes doing the wrong thing that gets you immediate benefits can also seem like a good idea until, of course, you end up paying the price later on. So again, not to worry too much about those individual folks. The main point here is that this sense of being ethical and doing the right thing is actually a behavioral challenge, I think, as much as it is an ethical and a legal challenge. So if we almost think about it, as the economic point of view, saying that people are rational and of course they'll do the right thing, starts to suggest some of the same challenges as saying that regulations lead to ethical behavior. We all know that they're essential. They're part of what help people to know what's good and what's bad. But we also have to recognize that there's a lot of sort of gray area here, not in what to do well, but in the sense that people don't often follow something just because it sounds like the right thing to do or because it's a regulated, correct answer. Oftentimes, the rules are there and people find ways to work around them anyway. But what we can do is recognize that some understanding a little bit more about the decision making that can help people to keep themselves from doing the wrong thing or ways to encourage more ethical behavior. There's actually a really strong role for behavioral science to play in this case, partly because we can start to recognize that just knowing the right thing doesn't always lead to the correct results. And we can also start to apply some of the really interesting evidence from many, many decades of research that can help us to target, what's going wrong? How can we start to sort of interrupt some of these less than helpful behaviors that can lead to unethical behavior or lack of compliance? So kind of teeing up why behavioral science actually has something to say here, I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular case, which has some very concrete illustrations of how that is useful and why it made good financial sense, not just good ethical sense. So full disclosure, I was not actually part of this project, but this is something that Deloitte, when I was there, a different team helped with. And so it's a little bit dated, but a really interesting example about how to understand the value of behavioral science in sort of interrupting some of these tendencies to do the wrong thing, in this case, around unemployment benefits. So in New Mexico at the time, the payouts for New Mexico unemployment were huge. And 4 billion extra was being paid out to people who either were fudging the numbers a little bit or for whatever reason didn't deserve that. So this is obviously a financial issue to fix in addition to an ethical one. But what they did that was really interesting, and there's a sort of a shorter form video that takes a closer look at this case study. What they actually discovered, first of all, is that there were several key things that claimants were doing, which were leading to some of the highest rates of payouts that were unnecessary. So the first was recognizing that people would sometimes check the wrong box. Rather than saying you were fired, for example, you just say that, well, there were some, plant closures or that, it was a broader kind of layoff that wasn't individual. And it was sort of, when all you have is a checkbox and you check things one or off, it's very easy to feel like, well, who's going to notice? This is a small thing. So the nudge or the sort of intervention that was tested here was that if you show somebody a letter saying, this is what we're actually going to send your former employer, that little bit of hesitation, you read it, you realize that you're actually going to say something which is false. You recognize that, somebody on the receiving end is going to know that you said something incorrect. That little pause was really helpful, and it interrupted people's behavior to do the wrong thing. Another sort of easy fix that people found, it was not uncommon for people who were making a bit of money to not report it, because that would then, of course, lead your benefits to go down. So let's say you were working 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week, very easy just to say, I didn't really do any work, and so those benefits would stay. Didn't really feel like anyone was getting hurt, and very easy to rationalize that away as like, well, no big deal. Again, from a behavioral standpoint, recognizing that just giving a prompt of a message, a little bit of hesitation, in this case, indicating that socially speaking, you're an outlier if you are the one who is, not claiming the time that you actually spent working. So in this case, recognizing that people want to be seen as honest, they want to be seen as a good person, just that message alone was enough to get people to sometimes do the right thing and to report accurately. And then finally, the third sort of big source that they found of potential fraud was that people would not, oh, I realized it's not reporting weekly earnings. This was actually about saying that you were going to do a search. So if you didn't do any work and you didn't do a job search, that could then sort of lead you to say, like, well, of course I did some work. Of course I did some searching, even though you hadn't actually done that. So in this case, being forced to actually say, this is my plan for next week, that little bit of a nudge that helped people to recognize I committed to something, so I really should follow through. This was actually quite effective. And when you add it all up, it was to the tune of billions of dollars. So claimants were not only more likely to follow through on the correct things, doing what they said they had actually done and reporting it correctly. The really nice sort of side benefit is that people who said that they were looking for work but hadn't really done it were now a little bit more committed to looking, and it actually increased their ability to find work. So it had these ancillary benefits that were also pretty impressive. All told, 40% reduction in fraud without the addition of extra resources, pretty great. And then, obviously not every nudge, not every solution is going to get these kinds of benefits, but recognizing again the types of sort of interventions that can help people be more compliant by adding little bits of friction, a little bit of extra work, actually really paid off. So this is kind of one specific case study. And this notion of adding friction more broadly is really interesting as we start to think about how does that potentially play a broader role, not just in compliance, which is what the New Mexico case did, but we can also start to think a little bit more broadly about how taking an ethical lens and a behavioral lens and adding friction to help people stop and think and reflect has the additional possibility and the additional benefit of helping people to stay on the straight and narrow. So this notion of adding friction, again, it's not completely new. There may be ways in which people are already familiar with things like waiting periods, for example, in purchasing guns, or, don't buy chips if you don't want to eat chips, the sort of additional friction that we see in both policy and individual work. But we can also see it, again, working in a bunch of different ways. So the tactical way in which we may apply friction can come in a bunch of different ways that may be able to address different types of behavioral interventions. This picture, by the way, I'm old enough to remember when we still had to bring credit cards to a store to buy things. And no joke, there were actually people who sometimes would put their credit card in a block of ice in the freezer as like a self-prevention technique, right? If you can't bring the credit card to the store, you can't spend it. We obviously live in a world now which is a little bit more complicated when everything is online, but sometimes even like using that sense of friction on ourselves can be quite effective. But it can also, for example, reduce our tendencies to go into autopilot mode. So adding just a little bit of friction can help us sort of stop and pause and reflect and do something a little bit different than we might have when we're just doing the same thing we always do. It can also, though, slow down on-ramps for doing the wrong thing. If we sit and reflect and kind of recognize that doing something wrong is going to have certain types of implications, it can sometimes stop us. Just that little bit of extra consideration can be really helpful and prevent us from just doing something just because it's easy. It can also make it more harder to rationalize away those things. So if you recognize, for example, that what you're going to do, if you do something wrong, is actually going to have implications down the road, and starting to play those out and getting concrete can have a real sort of staying power. It can keep us from doing things that we know we shouldn't, but are a little too tempting. However, at a systems level, we can also see the benefit of introducing friction in the right way. So most often we see what happens when a lack of friction actually causes significant problems. Arguably, a lot of the housing crisis in 2008 and thereabouts was caused by a lack of friction that didn't allow for some of those sort of effective stopping points. It meant that people got overcommitted on mortgages, for example, and we paid the price at a really big systemic level. We also see, for example, the lack of friction when things get deregulated. That can mean that it introduces too little oversight. And it means that now some of those stopping points actually aren't there. And so we can't prevent bad things from happening. It makes it a little bit too easy for those to move forward without prevention. So if we think about this use of positive friction as a general strategy, there are a couple of things that we might think about how that can apply more specifically. So sometimes, of course, we want to get people to do the right thing, and sometimes that right thing is really obvious and really clear and straightforward, as it may be in a compliance standpoint. But when we're thinking about fair and ethical behavior, sometimes that can be a little fuzzier, and it might mean that we have to open up our sort of bag of tricks and think about some different ways either to interrupt or inhibit things that aren't the right behaviors, or in some cases to use friction to call attention to and heighten what it is that's important and what we should be actually paying closer attention to that we want to emulate. So again, from an organizational standpoint, think of these as all potential strategies. There's not one right way to do it, but it can be helpful to consider what we're trying to do and then recognize how we might intervene or create opportunities to help encourage the right kinds of behavior. So just a couple of concrete examples here. I live in Chicago, so but we all lived through the pandemic. So for example, a really kind of clear case of being able to create a benefit to adherence and to compliance immediately comes to mind when we all had to show our COVID cards of vaccination. People were just desperate to go back to real life, right, and regular life and go to restaurants and bars and travel on planes and whatnot. So of course, that's a very dramatic and a very stark example, but that's the kind of case where simply it wasn't about, of course, it's a mandate, but it was because what we wanted was on the other side. By having this card, by getting your vaccinations, it means you can go out again. So being able sometimes to position something really beneficial, not just punishment, but recognizing that it allows us access to new things can be incredibly powerful if we want compliance to make more sense to people. There are different ways, of course, that we can think about what is good or what is not so useful. When we think about compliance, it's sometimes just reminding people, for example, of, in this case, more of a penalty. So recognizing that you may be being watched, for example, can keep people, inhibit some of those tendencies that they may have to, a little petty thievery is harder to accomplish if you sort of realize, oh, yeah, okay, there's a stick at the end of this. I certainly don't want to, be prosecuted. There are also, though, from an organizational standpoint, need to have the recognition that sometimes this level of oversight can step too far. So like any of the strategies or tactics that I discuss here, some things may seem good in small amounts, but if we take them too far or if they're used in the wrong way, can actually create what's called reactance, where it actually takes people from doing the right thing and actually makes them want to sort of push back against it. So, for example, there is sort of a fad right now, or has been, where people are monitored remotely, for example, being able to see when people check in, even what keystrokes they make and the work that they're doing. There's not a single person I have talked to who likes being on the receiving end of that. And in fact, it can end up, rather than leading to good compliance, it can end up creating a real asymmetry of sort of confidence and trust in leadership, because if they don't trust me, why should I trust them? So again, sometimes small doses and sometimes using things for the right reason makes all the difference. Another couple of examples of ways in which we can create friction. I don't think any of us are ever in the position where we're on a boat with harpies. This is, of course, a famous painting of a famous story of Ulysses, in which keeping himself and keeping his boatmates from listening to the beautiful songs of the sirens kept them from slamming into the rocks in this case. But in a less dramatic way, sometimes we can inhibit our own responses and our own work and the ways in which we think about what we are even exposed to. So if we know that we are likely to act in a bad way when we're in a certain situation, sometimes it's not always possible, but sometimes it's as easy as removing ourselves or making sure that we're not accessing those types of situations, which we know will prey on our worst instincts. So that sense of kind of self friction can also be a way that we can prevent some of the negative effects that we may otherwise run into. But increasingly, behavioral scientists are finding some really interesting, more tactical ways of thinking about other types of sort of bad behavior and how to consider how friction can be usefully sort of preventing us before we're even in a situation. So this idea about making implications or making the results more salient has been shown to be beneficial in a few different interesting ways. There's some really, really interesting research, for example, around misinformation and disinformation. So we're all surrounded these days by lots and lots of content. We know that not everything we see is true, but it can be very easy to not only forward on things that we may be less than sure about, and certainly we're often on the receiving end. So this is a little bit more, it's less about compliance, a little bit more about kind of wandering that sort of hazy moral line about when one should believe or act on things when we know that there's quite a bit of sort of incorrect information out there. One set of really interesting results that has been done by behavioral scientists is looking at how we can pre-inoculate ourselves to some of the things that we may come up against. So this is not quite as stark as tying yourself to a post, but kind of recognizing when you may be in situations or when you may sort of start to read the cues about what feels correct or incorrect. What are the ways in which you can sort of self-diagnose your own tendencies to do things? There's a lot of interesting techniques where it's not just about telling people, but for example, the image here, there are some almost game-like elements that can help people to kind of practice and to sort of become better receptors to that. But there are also ways in which, for example, the concreteness of narratives or cautionary tales, we're much less likely to look at just data and do the right thing than we are to recognize that people we know, for example, or the things that we did have a specific effect. That concreteness makes a big difference. And we are, frankly, social animals. And so recognizing we're holding ourselves to that higher esteem. This is very similar to the case in New Mexico, for example, where 9 out of 10 people did the right thing. That can actually go a long way towards making sure that we're doing things properly. Just a couple of other quick examples that are a little bit more still behavioral science driven, but even a little bit more longer lasting and have shown really interesting results. This particular program was developed by several behavioral scientists here in University of Chicago, oriented towards helping young men to develop better ways to manage what otherwise might become kind of instinctual, impulsive, aggressive behaviors. So in this case, being able to, for example, recognize and self-regulate has shown some incredibly valuable progress towards things like reducing violent crime arrests or improving school engagement, graduation rates. In this case, again, like some of what we can do is to recognize our own tendencies and our own personal impulses. And by creating a better sense of responding to those, it can be very helpful in helping us get out of a jam or a situation where we know we might do the wrong thing. Social norms also very powerful. In particular, so the solar panels, for example, have been shown that if people think it's a good idea, they may not act on it, but if they see other people acting on these things, that little bit of friction again of seeing a visible result has really been shown in particular to help with increasing the adoption of this technology and the recognition that this isn't just good to do, but something that I actually should do. And then finally, social norms, of course, can work in the opposite way. So we are probably all familiar with a situation where seeing one person get away with something not great makes it a little bit easier to see it as a normalized possibility. This idea of social proof can work in both beneficial ways and also in not so great ones. So recognizing again what is being modeled makes quite a difference. And of course, we all live in a situation now where so much activity is mediated. Being able to recognize that you want to hold yourself to a higher standard to people who care about you and who you care about, in some ways becomes harder and harder when everything is mediated through screens, for example. So again, some of the things that not just as cautionary tales, but that we can be thoughtful about what helps these things work and what also may be additional sort of barriers to helping get in our own way. But just wanted to shift gears a little bit. So a lot of those were kind of traditional ways of thinking about increasing beneficial behavior. What I wanted to do now was just expand our view a little bit and do that through a couple of quick stories, both of which may be familiar because they've been around for a while. In the mid 1980s, Paul O'Neill was brought in as the CEO of Alcoa, which is a dangerous place to work. It's about sort of aluminum development. And so there could be some really serious accidents. And in fact, when he first came in, his first instinct was to not necessarily look at the stock price, but to recognize that the safety was actually sort of the most important thing to be thinking about and worrying about. And to stakeholders, that seemed a little sketchy because what you should be worried about as the CEO, of course, is stock price and making sure that we're making money. In this case, O'Neill's real focus on safety as a key element of what the company should be doing um, felt initially very strange, but actually had some really interesting benefits. Um, he was very consistent in terms of what he was trying to advocate for and recognized that it wasn't just about saying this once, but embedding this notion of safety into every single behavior that was part of the organization. What the result of that was is that first of all, it became a clear sense of broader goals. So this wasn't just about benefiting leadership. It was also something that on the line folks were expected to also find as important. And they were often on the receiving ends of course, some of these safety measures. There was also a consistency that was applied. So this was not just a single element or just a mission statement. At every single stage along the way, the idea of safety mattering and looking into making the place a safer sort of organization to work in was prioritized. It led to real benefits. It actually ended up increasing the sales or the stock price of the company. And it also cut down on safety measures. So what was interesting here, like when I look at this from a behavioral standpoint, you could argue, well, is this ethical behavior? Is it moral behavior? What's interesting to me is partly the way in which it instilled a new culture of looking out for one another, of making sure that we were all taking care of the right things. It also had certain financial benefits, but this idea of being able to understand an organization as a behavioral culture is what is really stark and interesting here. Um, a little bit of a cautionary tale on the other side. This is about 20 years later, around 2017, when Amazon bought Whole Foods. Things I think by all accounts are better now, but this is a case that many may be familiar with. When you have a clash of cultures, it can cause real, not just morale problems, but real kind of ethical and moral damage because there's a lack of understanding about what our rules are and how we should be thinking about how we collectively work together and who benefits from the types of behaviors that are being instilled. So again, this may not be classic ethical behavior, but to me, it also suggests a way of understanding how rules and organizations can end up having a huge impact on how people think about what the right answer is or the right thing to do. So we can learn from this. In some instances, for example, there was a really strong threat where Amazon sort of hyper organization met up against Whole Foods more, not laissez-faire, but more customer oriented approach. It meant that by not shifting gears culturally, you were at risk of, for example, being fired. So it was this clash of cultures that not only was uncomfortable, but actually led to, in some cases, negative outcomes. There was also, by all accounts, a real lack of transparency initially. Why are we doing things differently? There was a recognition that it was a different approach, but who benefited and who was on the receiving end, not so clear. There was also this interesting tension when I talk about friction. Spending time with customers is, in a sense, a use of friction that was actually beneficial or seen as such by people who were working in the store. Now that was replaced by the friction of having to fill out endless forms, for example. And the idea that you could simply see people, again, there's sort of documentation of morale being broken and just recognizing that it was an unpleasant place to work during that transitional phase. These are all aspects of organizational behavior, which incidentally or individually may not feel like they're super strong, but really contribute to a culture that can make it harder to support the moral and ethical and communal decisions that we think are probably the goal. So what we can think about here is the recognition that ethical behavior really isn't just about compliance or individual or isolated one-time actions or behaviors. If we bring it out to that broader systems context, we can recognize that oftentimes ethical behavior starts because there's a seed of understanding about what the culture even represents and a recognition that there are sort of shared goals or shared expectations. It also means that it's not just about executing on the right thing at one time, but that anytime we work in an organization, there's a longitudinal arc. We bring our expectations in. We also think of different interactions and different behaviors connected to one another. So the idea that it's just about correcting individual behaviors, often the way nudges might work, for example, where we look at a particular checkbox that somebody didn't check. I would argue that thinking about supporting ethical behavior also means thinking about all of those end-to-end and more institutional and cultural norms as well. Finally, we all know that ethical quandaries are real, and this isn't just about doing what's good or what's bad, but also in the case, for example, of Whole Foods and Amazon, there were just deeply instilled different ways of understanding what good looked like. So it wasn't that one was good and one was bad, but this conflict between different ways of thinking about what seems right, what seems like the correct thing to do. We have to recognize that there's a whole set of individual expectations, but also cultural ones that are a large part of how things work or don't work. And when we're thinking about designing at an organizational level, whether it's like I talked about at the beginning, bringing in innovation in one case or building a more ethical and compliant organization on the other, thinking all across at the systems level is actually quite essential. So if we take all this and if we think about this notion of developing sort of curiosity, if we think about this broader idea of moral awareness, for example, if we recognize that in some cases, behavior that is ethical and just and moral is also baked into not just human behavior, but the very infrastructures that support it, we can perhaps like open up the picture a little bit to think a little bit differently about even not just how to instill positive friction, but that it actually has different types of benefits. So if what I was talking about earlier on was a little bit more about this notion of either inhibiting behaviors that we know are bad or increasing the tendencies to do the right things, but in most cases, it's because we have a sense of what good looks like. We can also open from a cultural standpoint, recognize that being a little bit more open-minded actually has certain benefits to helping us see things differently, helping us understand people differently, all of which can actually set the conditions that can lead to more ethical behavior in a longer term and more deeply seated kind of way. So just going to end this with a few examples and ways to think about what that looks like. Some very clear, this is actually kind of straight out of behavioral science textbooks in a way. One obvious way to do that is thinking about who is even part of an organization. So it's been shown, for example, this is a case where in the case of symphony orchestras, mostly men, for a long time, that was up to 95%. It was a hugely sort of male-oriented profession, even though very capable women musicians were auditioning. The friction that's applied here, but we can think about this beyond orchestras, of course, is taking away the ability to see who it was that was playing the instrument and focusing only on what is it that they can do to help what, in this case, an orchestra sound its best. So the idea of sort of removing the autopilot expectations about who looked like the right kind of person to what is it that they're actually presenting ended up having enormous benefits. And we can see different types of friction in this case too, where it's simply interrupting our kind of go-to or automatic ways of thinking about who is the right person or what is the right thing to do, by being broader about who could be good and where are different skills useful can be really helpful. Um, there are different ways, and lots of people have documented how diversity, for example, is really helpful in not just creating a better environment. It can actually help with creating more creative ideas, and it's been shown to actually create more ethical contexts because we are getting more advice from other people who are not like us. So in this case, the friction that may genuinely be part of having a more diverse set of individuals can also serve a real benefit. It broadens our awareness of who could be our customers or who could be the people that we're working with, and opens up our ability to understand what is good or right and recognize that our way of thinking is not necessarily the good or only way to do that. It can also end up leading to better product design. This was something that was viral several years ago. It's a case, for example, of where, in this case, it's a soap dispenser, and people with darker skin would not be able to trigger the soap dispenser because it was based on light, and so darker skin didn't trigger the mechanism. Now, this is the sort of thing which could be very easily captured in early prototyping if you had people who didn't have white skin who are testing this kind of product. So a very specific example of overlooking something that may seem really obvious after the fact, but that we need to take a closer look at in the moment. Finally, sort of looking at friction can also open our minds and eyes in different ways by simply giving more creative freedom. Even though Google is well known and probably best known for what they call their 20% rule, and 20% of time on your own ideas and to develop things that aren't necessarily specifically required or that the company is particularly trying to pursue. 3M also had a similar system where 15% of employee time is towards actually creating things that interrupt the norms of what a company is trying to execute on in terms of efficiency. So if you argue that people really should be working and busy 100% of the time, actually taking some of that time away to work on something adjacent that isn't necessarily in the direct line or in the critical line of thinking can actually create new innovations and new ways of thinking about what needs to be solved for, because they're not just trying to emphasize efficiency. There's also this way that we can open up our minds as to what is important and interesting and can be pursued and is useful. So overall, this whole question about positive friction is partly about, of course, sort of the nuts and bolts. How can we be more compliant? How might we emphasize sort of the right thing to do a little bit more concretely? How can we ensure that people are going to do things because they're seeing good examples? What I love about this particular quote or this way of thinking too is that although it's hard to do, when we end up thinking about organizations as fuller cultures and thinking about organizations as sort of, again, a unit of themselves that we can understand and craft, it can really change our behaviors in really strong and powerful ways. So, for example, in this case, if we think about homes purely as investments or purely as kind of financial things that we happen to live in a more tactical way, we may miss the opportunity to recognize the different kinds of value that are part of what we do and how we work and how we live. So when we think about this in an organizational standpoint, of course, organizations have a bottom line. Of course, organizations, there's always going to be a push towards efficiency and a push towards financial solvency. That doesn't go away. And it's not to say that everyone working in an organization needs to be pals, but recognizing how within organizational contexts, we can collectively develop approaches and cultures that allow for more rational ways of understanding what it means to be an ethical person, but also supplement that with social norms and with ways of understanding what good looks like. We have a lot better chance of actually supporting those kinds of behaviors than thinking of it as only a place where sort of only the survivors move up. And that can lead to behaviors which tend to be a little bit less than beneficial to both individuals and the overall. So just in closing, like again, a recognition that this is not just about getting one thing right. There's often no perfect answer. Uh, my argument would only be that as we think about interrupting in the right ways for the right reasons can be really helpful. Any of these ideas benefit from testing and benefit from prototyping and seeing what is that right balance. What are the right ways? And this is what behavioral scientists and behavioral designers do as their bread and butter. There's always the recognition too that recognizing where transparency matters. For example, there are really interesting examples of positive friction. Meta has something where you can click to see why I'm seeing this ad. When we use ChatGPT, it can tell us, oh, make sure that you're being, that you're aware that this is not necessarily the correct answer. But sometimes we don't understand what's going on under the hood, so to speak, and that can prevent us from fully engaging and fully understanding and fully feeling confident that friction is helpful. There's also just flat out bad friction. Cass Sunstein is best known for recognizing this and instilling, for example, the idea of sludge audits to recognize where there's too much friction that is unnecessary. And as always, recognizing that sometimes positive friction may seem good on one hand, but also can have asymmetrical benefits and reactance because organizations do tend to be complex and the people that are in there may have different needs and different recognition. So all of these as a reminder that when we think about adding friction, when we think about behavioral interventions, not a one size fits all, recognizing the implications and ways that we might need to test things to recognize what works. But it does have a lot of potential in terms of thinking about how to encourage the right kinds of behaviors, both individually and at an organizational level. So with that, I think, yes, come to the end. I'm going to close my screen or stop sharing so we can get back to the conversation.
That was fantastic. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that some of our audience members who are most interested in corporate governance may be unfamiliar or hearing some of these terms or thinking about these terms for the first time. Systems design, behavioral lens, and even just design thinking more broadly. And so I want to ask just an opening question to you, which is, how do you, as a behavioral designer, how do you just tackle problems? It's just like a starting point. And how does that, mesh with ethics and compliance or governance? So just like the framework, how do you think about problems, which might be different than how some of our audience does?
Absolutely. No, and it's a great question. It's true because I do come from a design background. And so the way that designers tend to think about problem solving is often, we often go through what is called a reframing process. So sometimes, for example, somebody will say, like, people in my example at the very beginning, people aren't innovative. What I've been trained to do is to say, okay, yes, that's a symptom. That's something that we need to address. What designers often do is to take that step back and take a broader look. So it's not just about targeting immediately, like what looks like a way to drive innovation. In that case, we would take a step back and we would understand, we would do user research, for example, because partly what we may discover is that it's not about increasing innovation. It's that the idea of innovation is not really shared equally, or that people don't even know what that word means. So a designer like me who comes in and sort of thinks about organizations as a unit of design, our first step is often to actually take a step back and to figure out, like, are we actually solving the right problem? Because it can be very easy to say, like, well, this needs an app or this needs a specific fix, but oftentimes we'll find out in this case, for example, that, the communication or the language or, doing more training is not actually going to make a difference because people actually know what they need to do. It's recognizing, like, where are some of those breakdowns. So a diagnostic phase is actually incredibly important to design because that allows us to recognize, are we actually looking at the right things? Are we solving the problems that matter? And in talking to different people within an organization, for example, we can learn a lot, both about what has been done and hasn't worked, and also how to think about looking beyond the proposed solution to, like, what is it that we really need to be solving for?
Yeah. And I know from having lots of conversations and working with you a little bit, you have this incredible ability to take a problem or a very complex structure and truly visually represent it in a way that's very easy to understand. And I have been my eyes have been opened sort of from the design perspective, behavioral design perspective, what even that can do to help us really think through what are the actual drivers of some of these problems that we have in our organization. So I certainly appreciate that lens and that mindset. I want to ask you a couple questions about trade-offs or balance. So, and there's a question from the audience, but there's kind of two that I have in mind. So, one is, when I'm talking to people in companies, they don't want to go slower. They don't want friction at all. They want to go as fast as they can. They're constantly feeling like the decisions that they're having to make are under time pressure in particular, but all kinds of different pressures. And so they want to make decisions at the speed of business, and they're looking for ways to be more efficient. And so you're pushing back against that and saying, okay, we want friction. So the first kind of trade-off question is, like, how do we find that balance between positive friction and then also being able to move fast enough that we can sort of operate at the speed of business? And then the second component of that comes from our audience member, which is, how do some of those interventions that might slow us down, or any really behavioral interventions, how do those impact trust? And could those potentially erode trust, which then again is kind of a problem or potential problem? So where is the balance between intervention and impacts on trust?
So, taking the first question, this idea of efficiency, 100% recognize that that is true. Because I think increasingly, I mean, we see this not just with the AI revolution that's happening, but this recognition that time is money, getting things done faster, cheaper, like all of that is absolutely part of what is part of business culture. It's almost unavoidable. So one way that we can sometimes get around that, or to address that and to sort of open it up, is to recognize like efficiency for the sake of what. So actually, again, like we can look at efficiency. Efficiency is not always effective. So if we're trying to get certain things done, of course, there are times when just moving through and getting things done and like prioritizing that throughput, that is sometimes going to be the most appropriate or the most kind of, obvious answer. There are times, though, when we can demonstrate, and this is where, again, not just talking to people, but recognizing, understanding from data, both quantitative and qualitative. Are we actually making a good case by doing things more efficiently? Are we missing opportunities? For example, it's very easy to measure what's being done. What sometimes is harder to measure, harder to capture, is like, what opportunities are we missing by only doing things in this sort of speedy way? So part of it is, I'm not saying it's an easy conversation all the time, because absolutely, I think that is almost all the time when I was in corporate practice and like working with corporations. Um, Analytic data, efficiency, like these were sort of the bread and butter language. What often helped was having these broader conversations about like, what are the actual goals? What are like different types of values, for example, that we can see being beneficial? I mean, just one specific example, you can look at things like efficiency, but sometimes, getting people to get things done. I did some work with a call center once, in a hospital or in a healthcare setting. And we recognized as the design team and as an innovation team that actually helping customers feel like they were being listened to was more beneficial for holding on to those customers than trying to address their answers very quickly, but incompletely and sometimes inaccurately.
Hmm.
So that may be the kind of thing where like efficiency seems great. Talk to as many people as you possibly can. What it ended up meaning, though, is that you had a much worse relationship and a more tenuous relationship with the very people you were serving, and it made them that much more likely to not be loyal or to go somewhere else. So figuring out like what are the different values, some of which may be in conflict. Efficiency in that case was going to get you certain benefits, but you were going to lose out on a whole bunch of others.
Yeah, and so your examples, the Alcoa example and also the New Mexico example too, also I think show us that slowing down at one phase doesn't mean that you're slow forever, if you will, right? So slowing down at one phase can actually create productivity gains and better outcomes over the long run, which ultimately is what most companies or most organizations want. So, and then what about the question of trust? Like, how do we develop interventions, behavioral or systems-based interventions that either don't erode trust, or if they do erode trust, what do we do about that?
So, of course, we want to avoid eroding trust wherever possible. And in fact, we all know that once trust is gone, it's really hard to come back. So some organizations are in a situation where they're on their back foot. They're defensive already because it's sort of doesn't feel like there's necessarily going to be transparency. I would say increased transparency, recognizing and being very clear about potential benefits. I mean, obviously, a company is maybe going to be interested in people being compliant, and that may be a more transactional way of doing things, but recognizing it's again, I think one of the benefits of something like that Alcoa story, where it was very broadly shared. Like people actually came to Paul O'Neill, the CEO, not just with complaints or issues about safety. They actually recognized that he was willing to listen. And so it was an opportunity not to be seen as a punitive thing, but like, oh, this actually allows us to think differently about what is meaningful or what matters. So I don't mean the idea of trust is huge. And I think that's where testing also is essential. We need to understand kind of where's the starting point, but also where is it that we want to go and how do we test how that's going to impact things like reactants.
Great. Ruth, I could talk about this, as you know, for forever. Unfortunately, we're at 1 o'clock. So I want to thank you very much for your comments. Obviously, people can go find Ruth on her faculty page at the Institute of Design, and also we'll of course post this video, and you can reach out to her separately. I also want to remind folks that our speaker series is now in full swing for the spring semester. So on March 5th will be our next speaker. We'll have Abe Singer from Loyola, who is a business ethicist. So again, trying to broaden our notions a little bit about what the core of corporate governance is. And so just like with Ruth, I think we'll be learning a lot through Abe's talk. So with that, thank you so much for joining us at the ICGE, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.